Welcome everybody, my name is Niclas Huschenbeth and I would like to present to you my analysis of the game Magnus Carlsen against Veselin Topalov from the first round of the Sinquefield Cup. So this is one of the strongest tournaments of the year, 10 players competing and they're all super strong, and we have the same pairing, Carlsen against Topalov, as in the Norway chess tournament earlier this year, which is also part of the Grand Prix Tour. So there are 3 tournaments in the Grand Prix Tour: Norway Chess, Sinquefield Cup and London Chess Classics later this year, and they all feature the top players in the world. We have the same pairing, Carlsen against Topalov, and most of you probably remember back then there was an unfortunate accident where Carlsen didn't know the time control and he lost on time in a winning position against Topalov in the first round, and this greatly affected his play in the consecutive rounds. So same pairing, let's get into it and see what happened this time. Carlsen starts the game with e4, c5, knight f3, d6. So now the question is open Sicilian or not. Carlsen goes for bishop b5 check. You actually don't see Carlsen play a lot of open Sicilians. He rather goes for quiet lines, for the positional lines. Now knight d7. The most popular choice here for black is bishop d7, but knight d7 keeps a little bit more tension in the position, more fire. So castle, knight f6, rook e1, a6, and this is a move which really has gained a lot of popularity in the last few years. Bishop d3 back instead of taking on d7, and now I would like to follow up with c3, bishop c2 and d4, and in fact oftentimes we rather see positions that resemble the Ruy Lopez and not so much the Sicilian. Here Topalov played b5, and now we won't see Ruy Lopez positions. Carlsen answers with c4, and he would like to open up the position immediately to make use of the fact that the black king is still in the center. And in fact, I myself had this move on the board earlier this year and I was quite surprised to see it. Didn't expect that move. I played knight e5, but Topalov was prepared and he had an interesting move here, g5. Wow. And Carlsen didn't know this move, so he was out of his opening preparation and he started spending time. So what's the point? We'll see the point in a moment. After knight takes g5, the black knight can come to e5 without being able to be exchanged on e5, obviously with the knight on g5. White can take on g5. He could also drop back with the bishop, just prophylactically bishop c2, and now after g4 he can answer with e5, and I think he would have a slight edge here after d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5 and e6. It is quite a double-edged decision for Topalov going for this move g5, because of course he's putting on pressure on the white position, but on the other hand he's also clearly weakening his position on the king side. So quite a double-edged decision. So knight takes g5 played. Now knight e5, bishop e2, and black regains the pawn, takes on c4, and also has the option in some case to go with the knight to d3. If for example f4, black would answer with knight d3. Now white has to get rid of this pawn on c4 sooner or later, because otherwise he has great difficulties to develop his bishop on c1. And here Carlsen spent a lot of time afterwards in the press conference, or rather with Morris Ashley in the interview. He said he now decided that he is going to sacrifice a piece by playing knight a3. He's not sacrificing it yet, but he made the decision already in his mind. And I don't think that was the right decision. Of course, it's easy for me to say because I know how the game went and I know also the evaluation of the computer. He should have instead just played knight c3, just the normal way. Rook g8 and now d3, and we have a roughly equal position on the board. Or maybe actually white has a slight edge here. Okay, instead he played knight a3. Obviously wants to take on c4, but rook g8. And this makes a lot of sense, placing the rook on the half-open g file. And now Carlsen sacrificed the piece by taking on c4 with the knight. Instead he should play simply d3. Now h6, knight f3, c takes d3, bishop takes d3, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and now d5 seems to be a good move. And black equalizes here. He takes d5, queen takes d5, and black is completely fine. But Carlsen is going for knight takes c4. So if now black takes on g5, then white can answer with f4 and hitting both the rook and the knight. But instead of first taking on g5, black takes on c4. And only if white takes back with the bishop, then he would take on g5 and not running into a fork anymore because, well, there's no knight on e5 anymore. So here Carlsen played d4. That was his idea. There was another way to sacrifice the piece with knight takes f7, but also that doesn't promise white too much. Simply e6, and white has 2 pawns for the piece, and the black king is a little bit insecure, but it's just not enough. It's just not enough. Black is safe enough. So instead d4. Now white is defending the knight and also taking away the square on e5 and is threatening now to take on c4, but black simply moves away the knight to b6. And here Carlsen played bishop h5. Objectively speaking, d takes c5 would have been a better option, but nevertheless it's simply only white who's fighting for a draw here after knight takes f7, after the queens come off, especially with the queens off the board. White of course has way less attacking prospects, and he's just fighting here for a draw with 2 pawns for the piece. So Carlsen played bishop h5, hitting the pawn on f7, and black takes the bishop, queen takes, and here he has a decision how to defend the pawn on f7. Either rook g7, which Topalov played, or rook g6. And in fact rook g6 would have been slightly better. Now knight takes h7 in this case doesn't make a lot of sense, because black simply moves the bishop to g7. And this is just fine for black. Really fine indeed, in fact. So instead white could take on h7, but now rook g7, hitting the queen, queen h8, and now c takes d4. And after knight h7, black is happy to give the exchange and enjoy a beautiful position here with 2 pieces against the rook. So best would be to take on c5 first and then to take on h7, but once again rook g7, and now queen h5, and now queen d7. This is a really good move to try to exchange the queens, because once again if the queens come off, a lot of the pressure is alleviated from black's shoulders. So Topalov didn't go for rook g6, but rook g7 is also just as fine, just maybe objectively slightly worse. Knight takes h7, but here Topalov made a mistake. He played queen d7, and I was actually surprised that none of the players mentioned it in the interview afterwards. We'll see it in a moment. Instead of playing queen d7, difficult move to play, but a better move would have been knight d7. Now black can take with the knight on f8. This is the whole idea. After d takes c5, d takes c5, now e5 threatening e6. Black has to play e6 to defend against this threat. Rook d1, now threatening knight takes f8, but black is just able to cope with all the threats. And in the resulting position here, black is still having the upper hand, but white is having some activity, and it's certainly not easy to convert this position to a win. So let's see what happened after queen d7. Now Carlsen first took on c5, but here he played e5, and I'm not sure what he didn't like about knight takes f8. Obviously black cannot take back. this would just lead to immediate checkmate here after bishop h6 and queen takes g8 mate. So black has to exchange queens one way or the other with queen g4, queen h3, and he should go for queen h3. This was the idea of queen d7, to exchange queens. Okay, queens come off, but it doesn't change the matter that black can't take on f8 nevertheless, because here white pins the rook, wins the rook on g7, and then has two pawns and the rook against two minor pieces is actually better. So black cannot do that. So he has to do something else. Maybe Carlsen wasn't sure about the position of his knight on f8, that at some point it might drop, but it's actually not easy. And if it drops, as for example after rook g8, knight h7, f6, now preventing knight g5, at least white is getting a couple more pawns. For example here, e5, once again trying to open up the squares for the knight with rook h8, but here, okay, white gets another two pawns and this position is equal. White can continue with f3 followed by g4 or maybe bishop g5, and he has certainly much better prospects for a draw than in the game. So I don't know what Carlsen didn't like about knight takes f8, but that was the way to go. He played e5, threatening e6, but black just prevents this threat by playing queen c6. There's also the threat of knight f6 in the air, but black can always simply play king d8, so it's not really a problem. And the king finds a rather safe spot on c7. Okay, for now there's a checkmate threat on g2, so Carlsen played f3, queen g6, now forcing the queen exchange, because once again we have this checkmate threat on g2 as well as, of course, threatening to exchange queens. Now knight f6, simply king d8. Black doesn't need to take, he could, but it would only give white chances here after f takes g7. And now g8 queen, white regains the queen and is not much worse here. So simply king d8. Now queens come off the board and we have this position where white has just two pawns for the piece and is fighting for a draw. Bishop e7, h4. Certainly a good idea to push the pawn forward to h5, doesn't hurt. Now bishop d2, knight c4. Here maybe instead of bishop c3, rook a1 would have been a better move, but in any case this position is really difficult for white, and I think in 9 out of 10 cases or 8 out of 10 cases white just loses, because the minor piece is just superior to the two pawns and it's really difficult to defend. So Carlsen played bishop c3, allowing bishop h6, allowing this bishop to come into play. Rook a1 check, king e8, rook d3, defending against bishop e3 or knight e3. But Topalov is simply continuing to improve his position, and there's really not much white can do. So I'll go through the moves rather quickly and point out where maybe Carlsen could have put up some more resistance. Bishop b5, rook d1, bishop c6. They were both pretty low on time, so it makes sense to simply repeat moves. And also in this case, Topalov gives Carlsen the chance or the opportunity to make a mistake, which Carlsen does by playing knight f2. He should have played rook d3, but doesn't change the assessment. Simply knight b6, improving the position of the knight, and sooner or later black will win. After knight f2, black has a tactical shot here, which he took advantage of. Bishop takes e5. And the point is that after bishop takes e5, black can play bishop takes f3, hitting the two rooks as well as the pawn on g2. Rook d1, rook takes g2 check, and now just a calm move, rook g5 back. The rook cannot really move because then, well, the rook doesn't have a lot of squares to go to in the first place, but if he goes to c2, then the bishop on e5 is hanging. So best would be to go bishop f6. Now black takes on e2 with check and takes on h5. We have this position. This is simply a technical win for black with an exchange and a pawn up. Still, that would have been the best defense for white, or the best option, but it just doesn't change the facts. This is all winning for black. Carlsen went knight g4 with just a couple of seconds on the clock, I think. Bishop takes c3, b takes c3. Now knight f6 is in the air, but black simply prevents this by playing king f8, king f2, rook h8, knight e5. And after a couple more moves here, bishop e8 defending the pawn on c5, g4, f6, rook e6. Well, just threatening something with every move, but just doesn't matter because black is able to defend everything. Rook c7, now everything is protected. Black's just up a piece for a pawn, and Carlsen decided to resign. Time control is reached, so there's really not much to hope for anymore. Gotta learn English again. Alright, so convincing win by Topalov. This time he won deservedly, to say it this way, compared to his win in Norway chess. The decision of Carlsen to sacrifice the piece early in the game was probably not the best one, and he never got the compensation maybe he was hoping for. There was this one moment after queen d7 where he had the chance to get back into a game by taking on c5 and taking on f8, which I think would have been rather natural, but he didn't go for it, and from there it was all Topalov, and Topalov just smoothly cruised to victory. Alright, first round was amazing. And this is why I decided to make another analysis, which you can check out. Just click somewhere up here, I'll put it. Aronian against Carano was also a fascinating game, so I also analyzed this in case you want to check this out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.